All right, so what are we here to talk about today? We are going to talk about why your governance is probably broken, most likely broken, and we'll talk a little bit about what we can do to fix it. Unfortunately, this is a 30-minute talk, so it's a little bit condensed, so I'll do more ranting about what's probably broken with your thing, and if you want to talk about solutions, the hallway will be a great place to cover that all. I will do one case study. So again, my background. So my name is John Ziola. I am a Pittsburgh local, born and bred, grew up on the east side of town. I currently live in the north side of town. I own and co-founded a cybersecurity, cloud native cybersecurity and compliance company called CISO. I've spent the last 7 years doing that. That's been a lot of fun. I also love open source. So if you work in like Kubernetes or any of those ecosystems, I'm what they call a CNCF ambassador. That means I'm one of about 20 people in the United States that get to talk about all the good things and use CNCF's money to run events and do cool stuff like that. I also teach classes for SANS. So if you've ever taken the Sec 540, the Cloud Security and DevSecOps Automation, that is one of the classes that I teach there. And so of all of this stuff, what really matters for this presentation is that, right? 7+ years focused on cloud native security and compliance, including a lot of audits. And when I say a lot of audits, I mean like blinking, all caps, bold, a lot of audits, right? And so a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is in having governance that I've either contributed to, written, or somehow participated in, get audited over and over and over and over at lots of different companies from lots of different auditors. Lots. And so a little bit more context, right? So what are the types of companies that I work with? These are environments where the technology is constantly changing. This is companies that are already adopting modern technology stacks. They're using DevOps, they're using Kubernetes, and for the most part, they're in the cloud, although some of them have some lingering parts on-prem. These are also environments where they have constantly changing personnel, right? Another great curveball. Oh, we have a merger, we have an acquisition, we've divested some unit to some other organization. We're just going to do a reorg because why not? We need another reorg in our lives. So those sorts of things happen a lot in these environments, and they can make your governance extremely tricky. These companies, because of their use of cloud environments, also desire extremely low toil. And so toil means like, laborious work that's not rewarding, right? We don't want manual, monotonous work for our people. We want to reduce that out as much as possible. And similarly, we want to be able to scale. These are, tech companies that want to be the rocket ship. They want to be the next billion-dollar, open AI or what have you. And so they're constantly thinking about how do we scale this out? I can't just throw more bodies at it because that's not going to scale. I've heard that more times than I can count. And so there's a huge focus on automated compliance and automated processes, as well as gathering large piles of data in order to inform the decisions that we make. And so we've got this interesting kind of separation here where you write governance, and it's typically done by a GRC team or some sort of a governance team. We write these Word documents or PDFs or maybe even their wikis. And that can be a little bit disconnected from the real world, what is actually happening in an organization. We'll talk about some of those pains. So we are going to start with a very, very, very short, I promise, background on governance. So if anyone is not familiar, so what is governance? Well, I stole this from Wikipedia. So thank you, Wikipedia. Governance, this is a modified version of what's out there. Governance is the process of making and enforcing decisions within an organization, right? How do we choose? How do we know what we're going to do next? Kind of like a process, but for an entire organization. We want to choose the right course of action given a scenario, right? We have some problem. We need to ship a new feature in our product. How do we do that and comply with what our organization requires? And this is what sets acceptable order within an organization. So this is like the definition of what's okay, right? Governance is what's okay in your organization, typically approved and reviewed by executives and then pushed down to the rest of the team for execution. You want to follow and align and update your governance regularly. And so one of the many hats that I wear is in the Kubernetes, what's called SIG security, or the Special Interest Group for Security. We are the group that assists the Kubernetes project with security things and the other parts of the ecosystem. We recently shipped a white paper, and there's the URL to it at the bottom. It's super, super long, so I made a shortened one. So if you go to scI.so/grc-paper, it'll send you to that big long URL at the bottom, just kind of for this talk. But the goal of this picture, this is from the paper, is just to illustrate where does governance live in a modern environment, right? So in a modern environment, we have GRC. GRC still holds up as the concept that we should be using. In fact, we debated that for many, many hours and days and weeks. Is GRC right? We came to the conclusion that we feel like it is. GRC are kind of the still, groupings that make sense, and they are a part of audit and assurance. In addition to audit and assurance, we've got operations, and then we've got like other sort of complex things. You can ignore the Kubernetes policy management. That's kind of a pointer to some other work that we've been working on to automatically assess environments against policies and things like that. So governance fits in audit and insurance. It's kind of the bottom line here. And you may have a policy pyramid or policy triangle. And it usually will look a little bit something like this. You'll start with this top level. Some people will say a vision statement, although I prefer to say the mission, because a mission is much more tactical. What are we doing today? And a vision is typically more like 10, 20, 30 years long. What would we like to accomplish? World peace, that sort of thing. But a mission is, what are we actually doing today? And so I typically see the mission as the top of this kind of policy pyramid. Next, we've got policies. In a policy, we say we will encrypt sensitive data. Very high level statements, general statements. We don't define exactly how we're going to encrypt that data. We're saying we're going to encrypt sensitive data, and this might be a type of policy that some C-level executive at your company reviews and approves, right? As you go down the stack, and you can see these sections get a little bit larger as we go, we're going to have a more detailed standard. The standard says we're going to use AES-GCM to do the encryption. Not just we're going to encrypt sensitive things, we're going to use AES-GCM to encrypt these sensitive things, or ECB, hopefully not, or CTR, or one of these other mechanisms, right? We're going to encrypt, but specifically which algorithms are okay, and then maybe have definitions as well about what is sensitive data, what is regulated, confidential data, public data. What are the categories of information you have in your environment? How do they map to requirements to encrypt or not encrypt? Then continuing to go down, we have procedures. These are the step-by-step instructions that we all know and love. Do A, then B, then C. We love to write them. Nobody reads or uses them like almost ever, but we've got them out there, right? And then we've got guidelines. Guidelines are very much like procedures, except they're optional, right? I think that's something that we all need to remember, is that guidelines, by definition, are optional. Okay, let's just sit with that for a second. So we would like to follow these guidelines. Please do, but you don't have to. If you have to, it should be kind of in a policy standard or a procedure. This is actually really important. I think I'll mention this a little bit later, because there's a difference between what you are doing and what you would like to be doing. And what you'd like to be doing is great for guidelines, but please don't put what you'd like to be doing in your policies and standards, because that's how you fail an audit, right? I would aspire to have perfect security, and I'm going to fail, right? And then I'm going to fail my audit, which is not a great experience. I've been there. All right. So very high level, we've got this stack of things. The most important thing to take away from this is the top half of it is requirements. And then at the bottom, we've got some nice to haves. And so we'll start with an example information security policy. I just asked ChatGPT to generate one for me, because I figured it would be kind of representative of the corpus of data that it was fed when it was trained. The scope of this policy, blah, blah, blah. So we're saying, what are the confines of it? What are we talking about here? And then what is it? It applies to all forms of data. This policy is integral to overall risk management, et cetera, et cetera. Does anyone see any problems with this? Would anyone be comfortable if this was a part of their information security policy? I noted one or two. So it loves the word all, and I didn't bias it at all, right? I didn't bias it. I just said, write me an information security policy. All. That's great. So 100%, literally perfect. We just said we are going to be perfect. Wow, we must be really impressive, right? If we're going to adopt that policy, we must be really good at what we do. Because I don't really know anybody who does all, right? But that's not it. There's actually more problems than that. I forget what my color coding scheme was, but yellow and orange were kind of like arbitrary or could be interpreted differently, right? So we've got things that are mandatory. We've got ORs, right? What is it? Anyone who has access, process, or store company data. So we're broadening what this applies to because we said or. And then later on, we've got systems, networks, applications, and devices. Again, we're being inclusive there. And so we're, again, broadening the scope because we said and. These are things that you should take extremely seriously. And I feel like it's very easy to be optimistic and to choose to put these sorts of words in your policy until you get audited. And they're like, but wait, they make it really simple, right? It makes you feel like you're 2 years old. What does all mean? All, everything, right? Yeah, 100%. Okay. So show me how you're doing that for all. Oof, right? All right. So this is just a high level information security policy pulled off the internet, tons of problems with it. And so when we're building governance, there's some key decisions you need to make. Some of them I kind of nitpicked in that document. First, are we going to document what is happening or what we wish was happening, right? I would highly recommend if you're going to be audited against this environment, it needs to be what is happening, and use things like guidelines to store what you would like to happen. In the cloud native space and observability, we have this idea of SLAs and SLOs, right? These objectives. And SLO is kind of a nice to have. We would like to have an uptime of 99.9%, but our SLA, what we're contractually obligated to meet, is 99%. We're going to try to hit that 99.9, but we're contractually obligated to 99%. Build something similar in your governance stacks. Have requirements that are attainable, that are the 99%, and set guidelines or set objectives for your team to exceed that by some specific number, 99.9%. Very, very few scenarios would I ever recommend to document what you wish you were doing in a policy or a standard. Now, other things. Are we going to be rigid? Are we going to say must? Or are we going to say should? We're going to make it flexible, may, right? I'd like this to happen, or this must happen. Because again, if you think about can I provide evidence that we are doing this 100% across the board, that might be difficult, right? Are we going to do a comprehensive governance where it's going to use the word all, or are we going to be realistic? And what does realistic mean? Well, it probably doesn't mean we putting documentation that says we sometimes do this. That's not going to go over very well. You might want to say we need to meet this bar of compliance, 90%, 80%, 50%. Who cares? Start somewhere, but start in a place that's realistic, that you can actually pass, and then update it regularly and get better, right? These things are not set in stone. You don't make a governance document and you don't update it for a year or 2 years or 3 years or 4 years. They should be fluid. And as you are able to provide evidence to yourself and to your auditors that you're meeting or exceeding these, you can raise the bar on yourself. Because again, governance, right? The idea of governance is executives, maybe the owners of a company, are describing what they want their team to do. And they don't like being lied to. I don't like being lied to, right? So when things say all in a document, as an executive, I sign off on that document. Great, yes, we are going to do all. And if nobody informs me that all is a $100 million investment, but 99.9% is a $1 million investment, I'm going to be a little perturbed, right? We want to know and spend money in very reasonable ways. And we want to actually know what is happening in these environments. So more things to worry about. Are we going to be generic so we can simplify these documents? Are we going to be specific so we are clear? Can you actually use the governance document to answer a question? That's really important. Don't we want these governance documents to be able to people who use them to self-serve the answer to a question, right? I am writing this code. I want to go look at the documentation and say, in what scenarios do I need to encrypt, and which scenarios is it a nice to have? Because if it says I need to encrypt and I've got this scenario it's going to be very costly in order to encrypt it, I've essentially been pre-authorized to spend that money because that is a company requirement. We'll talk about exceptions later, but generally, that's going to be the approach. We want people to be able to read governance and use it. But we also need it to be maintainable, right? If it's too simple, it doesn't mean anything to anybody. And if it's too specific, it's quickly out of date. Now, in our governance documents, we are going to have to refer to roles, responsibilities, teams, maybe people. How do we do that? Do we say generic terms like senior leadership? Every company has a different definition for what senior leadership is. Are we going to use specific roles or titles or team names? We'll talk about later, when that's not a great idea. Or are we going to refer to specific people? So it is your job duty to do this thing, Bob. It is Bob's job to do this. Usually you don't want to say specific people, and there are various different reasons why you might want to do categories, teams, roles, or titles. Be very intentional. And I would also say, don't just make one choice and force yourself to stick with it across your entire governance stack. Just because you used it in one scenario doesn't mean you need to use it in every single scenario. So you don't always need to use roles. There may be a good scenario where you need to use a person or a category. Are you going to write one giant information security plan, one policy, and everything's going to be in it? Or are you going to break it up? And how many documents do you break it up into? 2, 5, 50, 100? I've seen lots and lots and lots of different policy stacks. Many of them, especially earlier in their lifetime, are one big document, right? Very difficult to approve and edit and get approved. So they start to break them up. Now you've got lots of different documentations because we're thinking and improving the process for the people who are writing the governance, right? If you think about this, if we write governance as a part of our job, we want to segment these documents, maybe based on the owner or the role, give it to them for approval. They have a nice tight scope that they can approve. And then we send it out into the world, and then people have to use it. And they can't find anything because it's not in that document. It's in some other document. And it used to be in that document. Now it got moved to the other document because it moved ownership. Someone's job duties changed, and it keeps hopping different documentations, and pointers to these documents are wrong. And it's just like, I just need the answer to it. Why isn't it all just in one big document? And we'll kind of regress back to one big document and rinse and repeat. And finally, there are many more. There are many more decisions you need to make. But for this list, do you make exceptions easy or difficult, right? Do we want to allow people to essentially self-approve an exception to a policy? Or do we need to require that they can only do this if they get the president, the board of directors, or the CFO to sign off on it? Well, that's probably going to be hard. It doesn't matter if you're a 10-person shop or a 100-person shop. Those people are probably pretty busy. Are you really does it make sense to ask them these sorts of questions for exceptions? Also, does it make sense for you to be able to self-approve them? The answer is maybe sometimes, right? Great consultant answer. But we need to decide how difficult or how easy we're going to make these. And I would highly recommend, if you're making a new governance environment, to make them easy to do, but also easy to query, right? You want to be able to see what's going on, but don't stop people from doing their work, right? As you're rolling out a governance stack, make it easy to grant exceptions, but also easy to query and turn those into reports so you know what's happening and you can roll those up into risks, right? And concerns. All right. So we've built a new governance stack for a company. We've considered those 7 problems. We're pretty happy with where it's at. Now we're going to talk about day 2 problems, right? We've kind of made it and it's functional and we're about to get audited on it. And where does the confusion lie? Let me do a quick time check here. Okay. So I've got 10 of these. I don't know how much time we'll have for all of these. So first of all, spaghetti governance, right? I took our one document and I made it 50 documents because it's way easier for me as the governance person to manage it. That's great. Nobody can use it. Nobody can find it. All you've done is made spaghetti, right? They need to follow this reference to this reference to this reference. The definition of that term is in this centralized document, right? Because we wanted to centralize all of our definitions so we don't have to rewrite them in every document we've got. But now if you're using it, you've got to go to that one central to get the definition. And then you've got a reference to the standard from your policy. So you have to pull up the policy and the standard. And, you've got a reference to a defined term that needs to be, read in a 4th document. And I don't know how many monitors you have, but I don't have enough. I do not have enough monitors to handle that. Exceptions. So maybe you made it really easy to do exceptions, right? Like I just kind of recommended. Well, now you've got 500 of them. So what do you do, right? What do you do now that you've got a long list of exceptions? How do you manage them? Do you apply back pressure? Do you make it slightly more difficult? And I don't mean difficult as in toil. We don't want someone to just labor and, be able to get an exception because they spent more time on it. We need to make sure that we're putting these information, the exceptions, into the right place to be approved. The right role, the right person in your company is approving them. And you need to start to build broad awareness of what your exceptions look like. When you started this program, you just said how you can make exceptions and what the rules were. On day 2, day 5, day 100, you've got a long list of exceptions. You need to manage those and do risk assessments against them and say, how bad is it because we are not following our own processes? Are we out of compliance with our contracts? Mandating the impossible. This is one of my favorites. So you wrote something in a governance document that you thought you were doing and sounded like a great idea at the time, but it's actually impossible. So you will probably find as you run a governance program at your company that you've got lots of impossible things written in your governance stack. Now what? Do we make it more specific? Do we add more words? Do we just keep adding on? I always think of these things like a snow cone, right? You start with like 1 scoop, 2 scoop, 3, 4, 5, and then you've got like the Leaning Tower of Pisa here. It's going to all fall over and make a big mess. You can't just keep adding, and you can't refactor it every time you look at it. Also, don't do that. When you follow that process, when you just keep adding things onto a governance document, you'll find yourself saying so much that it says nothing. We have users of our governance. They need to read and understand it. Key point there. They need to understand it, not just read it. When they onboard, if you've got a process, a checklist that HR goes through and make sure that they sign off on the acceptable use policy and the blah, blah, blah policies, that's great. That's cute even, right? Okay. 99% of people have no idea what they just read. And most people just signed it. They just checked the box, right? And they just moved on. We're going to get our job done. This needs to be easy to understand and read. That means that's going to be harder to maintain. It's unfortunate, but that's what it is, right? We might need to take 5 pages and turn it into a flowchart or a graph. How do we make this stuff easier to consume? And how do we avoid anything that looks like that? This is actually ChatGPT. I said, say as many words as you can, but don't say anything. It was much longer than this. I truncated it. This is another great one. So I'm trying to read the governance. I'm trying to use it. I'm trying to do exactly what we wanted. There's this one sentence in here. Can someone tell me why it's there? Does anyone like run governance and like for their organization and just like dread that question? Like, why was this sentence or why is this word used? Why is it and instead of or? I don't remember. 5 people before me put that in there and we were scared to touch it. That's what I hear most of the time. Like, oh, yeah. This is a huge, huge, huge problem. Why do we have governance in the first place? We have governance to simplify this external world that's extremely complicated. All of the contracts that you have, all of the states and countries that you work in, you've got regulations, you've got frameworks that you might choose to abide by, ISO 27001, SOC 2, CMMC, FedRAMP, HITRUST, blah, blah, blah. There's a bunch of them. That's great. We want to do all of those things and we need to maintain that for our company. And again, you're just going to keep adding and adding and adding things to your governance and making it completely unusable. On day 2, on day 100, someone's going to say, why is that there? And I'm like, well, I don't know which framework or which law or which regulation or which lawyer decided that was a risk decision that we need to make. I don't know why this stuff is here, right? Extremely important to find a way to put metadata and context with all of your statements inside of your governance to know why something was there. Perfect example. If you don't need to do something, you probably don't want to do it, right? If you don't need to do it, if it's not reasonable to do, say you have a client and that client is ridiculous expectations, but they're willing to pay cold hard cash for you to follow them. Great. Your executive leadership might choose, let's follow these crazy requirements. Then they get put into your governance because those are your company's requirements in order to make millions, billions of dollars. 5 years goes by, you're no longer working with that client. Wouldn't you love to be able to remove all that garbage from your governance because it was only mapped to that one contract that you're no longer working with them on? But how do you know? You need to know why it's there in the first place. I'm going to move a little faster here because I don't know how much time. I have 5 minutes. Broken references, when you update things, it'll get messy. Absolutely, that happens all the time. People are very overly ambitious. I would love, the one thing that always stuck with me that I saw in a policy statement once was all employees must have at least WPA3 on their home network. Yeah, right. Prove it. Like, how are you possibly going to do that? Anyways, being overly ambitious, that's one example of it. Is it covering what it should? We are in Europe, we're in the US, we're in China, we work in Australia. Is it meeting everything we need? How do you know that it's meeting everything you need? Things being too specific or not detailed enough. I think that kind of speaks for itself. And my, again, I've got lots of favorites in here. Is arbitrary timeframes. These things need to be patched in 90 days. Why? What's wrong with 91 days? Is 82 not okay? Like, why do we have these arbitrary timeframes? Think about the process that happens before this time frame, some additional approval or going out of compliance happens, and you want to know exactly why that time frame is there. And so in some cases there are requirements, federal requirements, FedRAMP or something like that. It says you have to fix these in 30 days. And so we'll do a quick case study, very brief, on vulnerability management, where I see a lot of these things commonly used. So here is an example. We've identified vulnerabilities that need to be fixed. We use CVSS because we think that's a great idea. We've written this big block of text. Nobody knows what it says, but I can highlight a couple words. All of the critical vulnerabilities need to be fixed in 14 days, highs in 30 days, and mediums in 90 days. Anyone seen this before? Yeah, like everybody has seen this before? Yeah. Has anyone actually gotten in compliance with this? Yeah, exactly. So it's very unreasonable. And as soon as you're in compliance, you're out of compliance a minute later because they find a new vulnerability or the timer keeps going. So I love this LinkedIn post. This was just from the other day. It says, finding 5 vulnerabilities is better than detecting 10,000 of them. And I wholeheartedly agree. Our job is to understand what it looks like out there. We would need to detect them, but it is more important and we should prioritize fixing them and making it easy for people to fix the problem over finding them. Because finding them does not reduce the risk that our companies are taking. Fixing them does. So how do we do this? My recommendation is we're going to focus on identifying what matters. There's a technique I'll tell you about in a minute. How do we find what matters? Then how do we have an environment that's as minimal as possible? Let's start with less. Let's just rip stuff out. Then automate testing of our environment. How do we know that it's working? We need to know that it's working. And this is not a security thing. This is just a functionality thing. We need to automate testing and know that something is working. Then we can automate patching, because if we have a way to prove that it's working, we can just patch and patch and patch and patch and patch. And if the tests keep working, we can keep patching. Automated. No human person in the loop. We can remove unnecessary components. So maybe we can't patch something, it breaks a test, but we know about it now and we can start to remove things. Again, going back to minimalism and having less. And then we fall down to this last process of catch-all manual patching. And after this process, that should be extremely minimal. And I'm just going to give a little eye candy here. This is what EPSS is. I don't have enough time to talk about it, but it is a great way. I highly recommend looking at it to identify reducing toil, but patching vulnerability. So on the left, you can see this blue circle is everything that we've found, and the red circle is what can actually be exploited. And so we're going to do all of this work, and we're only going to fix that level of problem. EPSS helps you focus on the right things. It's not perfect, but you can see efficiency is 4% on the left, patching lots of things, but not actually reducing your risks. And on the right, it's, what's that say, 65%? Yeah, 65%. So it's a way to do vulnerability patching in a more efficient way. Push this upstream to your governance. Don't have those 30-day, 90-day, 14-day CVSS-based things. Consider more dynamic ways to identify what's important and patching it so we can actually get important work done. And I think I'm right on time. There you go. Nice. I don't know if we have time for questions, do we?
Yes. So anyone raise your hand for something like that since it's smaller room.
Yes, the, okay, there we go. Let me see. This one? Okay, there we go. That's the white paper that we wrote. Yeah.
Well,
Mm. Yeah. So how often should policies be updated? I don't think every company is going to be different. I think that what's most important with policies is that they're easy to update. If you focus on making them easy to update, then you can update them never or all the time. Whatever's right for your business. But if they're difficult to update, then you're going to add friction to the updating process and you're going to not update them when they should be updated. The other thing that I think is really important is if you can measure what's happening in your company and map it back to your governance, that should tell you when you need to do an update. For instance, you might want to be more or less aggressive because we keep failing. We're constantly out of compliance with this thing. We need to update it and lower the bar if we possibly can, or we need to get an investment to make this better, or the other way around. But if you're not automating the assessment of what your governance says, then you can't possibly know when the right time to make a change is. All right, that's probably all the time that we have. I think we can give a mug out for that talk, that question, right? Yeah.
Future small bucks, actually, like my classes too, with some larger. I can't. But yeah, everyone, John,
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.